Have you ever noticed how one mistake can echo louder in your mind than 100 successes ever did? You can receive praise, achieve goals, and move forward in life. Yet one failure quietly sits in the background, like a shadow that refuses to leave. For many people, the real pain of failure is not the event itself, but the invisible emotional weight that follows them long after the moment has passed. This weight has a name, and it is shame. Unlike guilt, which whispers that you did something wrong, shame shouts that something is wrong with you. That difference may sound small, but it changes the entire direction of a person's life. In the teachings often inspired by Dr. Grandpa Henry, shame is described as a silent anchor that keeps people tied to the past, even when the storm has already moved on. Imagine a person who loses a job, fails a business, ends a relationship, or makes a public mistake. At first, the reaction is shock and disappointment, which is natural and human. But then another voice begins to grow louder. It says you are not good enough, you never were good enough, and you will probably fail again. Slowly, the failure stops being an event and becomes an identity. Instead of saying I failed, the person begins to believe I am a failure. This shift is the moment when progress freezes and fear takes control. From the outside, it may look like laziness, procrastination, or lack of ambition, but inside the person feels trapped in a quiet emotional prison built from self-judgment and fear of being seen. What makes this more painful is that most people do not even realize shame is the real problem, so they try to fix motivation, discipline, or productivity instead. Here is where the suspense begins to build, because shame does not appear in obvious ways. It hides behind perfectionism, overthinking, people-pleasing, and the constant need to avoid risk. It convinces people to stay small, stay quiet, and stay safe. Opportunities appear, but they are ignored. Dreams return, but they are postponed. Life keeps moving forward, but the person stays emotionally stuck in the moment of their past mistake. This is why so many people feel like they are watching life instead of living it. They are not held back by lack of talent or opportunity, but by the deep fear of feeling that same pain again. And the longer this continues, the stronger the belief becomes that change is impossible. Even though the truth is that the real obstacle has never been failure itself, but the shame that followed it home. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet question waits to be answered. A question that feels uncomfortable yet powerful. What if the story you believe about your failure is not the truth, but only the echo of shame repeating itself until you accept it as permanent reality and stop trying altogether before realizing your life has passed you by? What makes shame so powerful is that it convinces people they are protecting themselves when they are actually imprisoning themselves. The brain believes it is creating safety by avoiding risk, avoiding judgment, and avoiding the possibility of another painful fall. This is why someone who once dreamed big suddenly begins to choose comfort over growth, routine over possibility, and silence over expression. Shame quietly rewrites a person's future by shrinking their willingness to try. Guilt, on the other hand, works very differently. Guilt says you made a mistake and encourages repair, learning, and responsibility. Shame says you are the mistake and encourages hiding, shrinking, and isolation. That difference determines whether someone rises again or slowly fades into a life that feels smaller than it was meant to be. Many Americans experience this after losing a job, ending a marriage, failing an exam, or starting a business that did not survive. They replay the moment again and again, imagining what others think, assuming judgment even when none exists, and expecting rejection before it ever happens. Over time, they begin to avoid opportunities that could prove their strength because the risk of failing again feels heavier than the hope of succeeding. This is the quiet turning point where life becomes predictable, but unfulfilled. The person tells themselves they are being realistic, but deep down, they know they are being afraid. This is where the teachings inspired by Dr. Grandpa Henry begin to shift perspective in a powerful way. Instead of asking, how do I avoid failure? The better question becomes, what if failure was never the enemy at all? The real enemy is the belief that failure defines identity. When people believe that success determines worth, every mistake feels like proof of personal weakness. But when people understand that mistakes are evidence of effort, learning becomes possible again. Imagine how different life feels when a setback becomes feedback instead of a life sentence. Suddenly, the past becomes a teacher instead of a judge. Yet this realization often arrives with resistance because shame does not disappear quietly. It fights to stay in control by reminding people of embarrassment, replaying memories, and predicting future rejection. This is the suspenseful moment where many people stand at a crossroads. One path leads back to safety and stagnation, the familiar world of staying small and avoiding risk. The other path leads toward growth, uncertainty, and possibility. The decision is rarely dramatic, and it rarely happens overnight. It begins with a small shift in belief, a quiet refusal to accept shame as truth. It begins when a person realizes that the voice telling them they are not enough has never been a reliable narrator of their story. That realization may feel small at first, but it is the first crack in the wall that shame spent years building. And once that wall begins to crack, the light of possibility starts to find its way through the smallest openings. Breaking the cycle of shame begins with understanding that freedom does not arrive in one dramatic moment, but through small, deliberate actions that slowly rebuild trust with yourself. The first step is learning to separate identity from experience. A failure is an event that happened, not a definition of who you are. When this idea becomes real, it creates space for compassion to replace self-criticism. Instead of asking what is wrong with me, the question becomes, what can I learn from this? This shift may feel simple, yet it is powerful enough to change the direction of a life. The second step is speaking the truth out loud, even if the voice shakes. Shame grows in silence and secrecy, but it weakens when exposed to honesty. Sharing a struggle with a trusted person, writing about it, or acknowledging it openly interrupts the illusion that you must hide to stay safe. The third step is taking small, visible risks again. Not giant leaps, not dramatic changes, but small, consistent actions that prove movement is still possible. Applying for one opportunity, starting one project, having one difficult conversation, or trying one new habit begins to retrain the brain to see effort as safe again. The teachings inspired by Dr. Grandpa Henry often emphasize that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward while fear is present. Every small action sends a message to the mind that the story is not over. Over time, these small actions create momentum, and momentum rebuilds confidence in ways that motivation alone never could. Another powerful step is rewriting the personal narrative that has been repeated for years. Instead of telling the story of the moment everything went wrong, begin telling the story of what that moment taught you. Instead of focusing on embarrassment, focus on resilience. Instead of remembering the ending, remember the lesson. The brain believes the stories it hears most often, and for many people, shame has been the loudest storyteller in the room. Changing the story does not erase the past, but it changes how the past shapes the future. Eventually, a new realization begins to emerge, one that feels almost surprising. The setback that once felt like the end becomes the moment that forced growth, strength, and clarity. The fear of being judged slowly fades as the focus shifts toward living fully again. Life begins to expand. Opportunities feel possible, and the person who once felt stuck begins to feel in motion again. This transformation does not mean fear disappears forever, but it means fear no longer decides the direction of life. And that is the quiet victory that shame never wanted you to discover. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.